Well, hello there, and welcome back once again to the Sage's Library. I am, as always, your humble sage, Trevor Duval. Thank you so much for joining me here today in the library. And if you do enjoy what you see today, please do hit like and subscribe, and perhaps even support us on Patreon or blah, blah, blah. All of the links for such things are below. Today, we are going to talk about an old classic. One of the first science fiction role-playing games ever to be made, and certainly one of the longest-lasting, probably the longest-lasting, and that game is, of course, Traveler. Now, this particular edition is the Mongoose Traveler First Edition. This is the one that I am most familiar with. However, that said, I didn't start with this edition. I started with a little edition called the box set here it is, all the way from 1983. That's right, this one goes back all the way to the heady days of 1983. Now, here's the thing about this game. This is a starter set before there were such things as starter sets. This is basically it's literally called the Starter Edition. But that was not particularly common back then to have a Starter Edition. This game started off as a series of little black books. I have none of those because, as I said, this was my first exposure to the game. But I don't have a ton of experience with this particular version of the game, and mostly because in 1983, I was 11 years old. And at 11 years old, this game made no sense to me. And not just because the system was what it was, which is not particularly complicated, but there's a few things that are a little odd, but we'll get into that. No, the reason why I couldn't particularly get into this at 11 years old is because in 1983, for me, science fiction was Star Wars. And this is not Star Wars. This game is very heavily influenced from the old school authors like Isaac Asimov or Heinlein or all of these people that wrote sort of classic sci-fi stuff from the 40s all the way up through the 70s. The truth is, I was always intimidated by the kind of sci-fi that this game was trying to show. I just never got it because I never read those authors, so I didn't really understand what the purpose of the game was. So this game is not Force users and Jedi and lightsabers. This game is more kind of hard sci-fi. So you're a crew of a ship and you have to worry about fuel consumption, you have to worry about paying the mortgage on the ship, and all that kind of stuff. So at 11 years old in 1983, I was like, I don't get it. It would take the year 2008 and the release of Mongoose Traveler's First Edition in order for me to start to gain an appreciation for what this game, in fact, was all about. I was older now, more well-read, and this new version kind of streamlined a lot of the things that I couldn't quite wrap my head around when I first saw the game when I was a little kid. For example, starship travel. Now, in the original game, if you wanted to go from a planet to another planet, there was a pretty complicated series of mathematical equations you were supposed to do in order to determine how long it was going to take, what kind of fuel you were going to consume, all that kind of stuff. And I looked at this big, algebraic equation right there in the rule book of the very first edition that I had, that starter edition, and went, nope. No, clearly you need a degree in advanced physics in order to play this game. You don't really, but that's what I thought, because I was 11 years old. And so I was immediately turned off by that. But in the Mongoose edition, they've done away with a lot of that. They've made it more approachable for people like me who are not exactly whizzes when it comes to the whole mathematical equations and such. So in addition to starship travel being made much easier to handle, there was the dreaded PC death in character creation issue that existed in the early editions of Traveler that Mongoose kind of altered. So how it worked was this. In Traveler, you generated your character through a life path system. Now, I believe Traveler was one of the first games to do this. Certainly D&D didn't do that. But basically, you don't just roll up a character like a first level kind of character. No, you create an experienced person who has been through many, many, many years of their various careers and emerge on the other side of character creation as a fully fleshed out character with a lot of skills and a lot of abilities to do things. The trade-off in Traveler, the original game, was that you never actually leveled up. The character you created in character creation was the character you were going to play. And basically how you leveled up was essentially by getting rich or getting a better ship or getting better gear or that kind of stuff. So one of the things that happened in character creation in the original game was that one of the consequences of various things that could happen to you in your background was that you could die. Die in character creation. A lot of GMs I know mitigated that. They would say, okay, well, you don't die, but you get a broken leg or something. You're -1 agility, whatever the case is. So basically, Mongoose's edition does just that. If you roll an event in your background, it's not going to kill you, but it's gonna have some effect on you, some long-term consequence. And I actually prefer that because obviously you don't have to immediately start rolling a new character because you died in character creation, but also those kind of long-term consequences from your life path backgrounds gives all kinds of backstory potential and backstory, a sort of sense of realism. So when these characters do come through their character creation process, they're not only skilled and, all that kind of stuff, but they also have scars. They're bearing the scars of their past. And I think that's super cool. Now, Mongoose also does give you the option to have character death and character creation for those old school guys out there who want to actually do that. So that's kind of cool that they included that, but by default, you don't die in character creation anymore. You just suffer consequences if you get unlucky. The other thing that's cool about the Mongoose system is that they really incorporate this idea of character connection. So the idea is that the players are all creating their characters at the same time around the table, and as they're going through their various life path creation systems, which I think is periods of 4 years, each cycle is like a period of 4 years, there's going to be stuff that happens to those characters, and it's contingent upon the players at some point to find commonalities in those background events to bind those characters together, which is very cool. So for example, if character A gets marooned on a planet, let's say, and character B is a scout, and at some point in that scout's career, they discover a new world, well, then maybe those two players go, oh, wait a minute, maybe the new world you discover is the one I was marooned on, and that's how we met 16 years ago. So it's a really sort of nice and creative way to bring characters together when they begin the game. So there's no you all meet in a bar sessions in Traveller, at least in this version of the game. All of the characters are brought together by this very detailed backstory that is created around the table together. Really, really cool way of doing it, and it does away with the idea that these people don't know each other right off the bat, and you can kind of dispense with that whole session 0 stuff where we don't really know each other, but no, you do. You all know each other, you serve together, and now you're all part of this ship crew going off to do your thing. And what's interesting is, especially in the original game, very often what you would do is you would keep doing 4-year life path cycles because you wanted to get more skills. But what that meant was, by the end of character creation, what you typically had was a bunch of old men sitting around, like a vice admiral of the fleet and an ex-army general, and they're all like 70 years old or something, and they're all on a ship together. So it was kind of this hilarious idea that these ships were basically like floating old folks' homes in space, except where the resident seniors were all heavily armed super badasses. It was always hilarious that tended to be the case for us in our games that I played in back in the 80s and 90s. Not so much now. Mongoose has altered the rules a little bit, so you don't have to go that far. But it was always sort of a funny idea that this is like the cocoon of role-playing games. Now, the core system from the original game to the Mongoose version was largely unchanged. Basically, you roll 2d6 plus a stat or a skill, or in Mongoose's case, both, and you apply it to a target number, and if you succeed, great. The original game, as far as I remember, was just 2d6 plus maybe a stat, and then it was against target number 8. If I recall correctly, it was always against target number 8. I could be wrong about that. I mean, I could look it up because it's right here, but who has time? But with Mongoose, it was a slightly different 2d6 plus stat and skill versus a number that was usually 8, but might be higher or lower depending on the difficulty of the task. Combat in both versions of Traveller was always a little confusing to me, mostly because of the initiative system. Now, I don't remember the initiative system in the original game, but I remember the Mongoose version. It had a really neat system for initiative that was called dynamic initiative. Unfortunately, I felt that with our games, dynamic initiative worked better as a concept than it did at the table. Basically, the idea was, I think you rolled like 2d6 plus your agility stat or something like that in order to put yourself in the initiative order. But dynamic initiative meant that initiative could flow and change from one round to the next. So how that worked was, if I'm on, say, 8 in the round, and I'm going before you, and you're on 6, then if I shoot at you and you try to dodge out of the way, you're using a reaction. Okay, well, providing you survive the assault, now your initiative's going down by 2. So now you're actually on 4. I think that's how that worked. And also, if you used an automatic weapon, there was a recoil factor, and that would knock your initiative down. And And eventually you would get to the point where now, you had to wait until next round in order to actually do anything. So I like the idea of dynamic initiative, but at the table, I never found a satisfying or practical way to actually keep track of it. And so it became kind of frustrating. In fact, it was the coolest rule we found that was the first one to be jettisoned from the game, unfortunately. You guys, if any of you guys have any ideas of how to track initiative in Mongoose Traveler, I'd love to know, because I've never found a satisfying way to do it. So by all means, let me know in the comments below. But before we go on with the rest of the Sage's Library episode on Traveler, here is a little word from this video sponsor. Today's video is brought to you by the team over at Broken Anvil Miniatures. Located in Washington State, this miniatures company is known for its excellent miniatures and fresh designs, all sculpted with painters in mind. The BAM team recently updated their web store and are now offering an incredibly fun selection of minis, including awesome models like this Centaur Druid, Dwarf Fighter, and Orc Queen. With so many cool designs, I couldn't possibly list them all here, so you'll definitely have to go check them out for yourself. Additionally, Broken Anvil is offering free domestic shipping, plus their exclusive Turkey Folk Paladin with orders of $40 or more this month. So if you've had your eye on any of their cool minis, or you're just looking for that perfect gift for the fellow hobbyist in your life, now is a great time to stock up on some of Broken Anvil's miniatures. There's a link to their store in the video description below. Now, one of the strengths of our game were the trade and commerce rules. Figuring how much tonnage you had available for cargo space, determining the exact worth of a cargo on this planet versus that planet, and trying to do trade deals with potentially hostile buyers or sellers were actually some of the great moments in this game, and we're all supported by a really interesting set of trade rules that are part of the core book. Which sounds kind of odd now that I say it out loud, because I think if you had said to me in 1983, hey, in a few years you're going to be playing this game, but one of your favorite things to do is going to be keeping spreadsheets on dedicated cargo space in a game of space exploration and adventure, yeah, I would have probably laughed you out of the room. And yet, that's exactly what happened. We really engaged with these trade rules in a lot of the cases. And our players, or my players in one of the games that I ran, became obsessed with the idea of trading and getting very rich because of it. And it became very, very satisfying, which is not really what I expected. And those rules kind of work really well with the world building rules, which are, in my opinion, top notch. The literal world building rules in terms of like what the atmosphere is of the planet or the law level and all this kind of stuff. Traveler assumed that you were going to use their default setting of the Third Imperium, but by no means did you have to. And so they give you all of these different rules to create your own star systems and subsectors and planets and the whole bit, which you could use even if you were using the Third Imperium setting, obviously, because there's lots of stars in space that need to be detailed. But with these rules, you could actually determine everything you need to know about these planets, from its atmosphere type to its government type to its tech level, which was a number between 0 and 15, basically 0 being primitive and 15 being like, oh my god, this is essentially magic. And each of these elements that you determine on these really interesting tables all work together to create a new and unique planet that not only feels like it makes sense, because the tables are very well designed in most cases, but also it provides you as the GM with like instant adventure ideas and adventure hooks for what might happen on this planet, or what might happen when the players land here, or how this planet interacts with the other planets in the subsector. And from that, you can start to create kind of a whole political system, or a political situation rather, in one subsector based solely on the information that you generate from these world creation tables. It's a really, really fun subsystem, especially for the GM to create these subsectors. And extrapolate all of this information about what's going on sort of politically in the subsector. I remember there was a really great session that was determined entirely from the world building tables, where our guys had to go to this planet, which was nothing but like methane and ammonia seas, basically, with a couple of little islands here and there. And they had to retrieve this case from the wreckage of a crashed ship. But of course, that ship was underneath this ammonia sea. So they had to get there. They had to get special vac suits that wouldn't deteriorate from the chemicals of the oceans there. They had to retrieve this case, and then they had to escape the enemies that were after them. And so there was this really cool kind of like speedboat chase in these modified vac suits on this liquid methane sea or whatever. And it was just really cool. But all of that, every element of that adventure was completely pulled from the random world building design that I had done using the tables in the core book. So super, super, super great adventure hooks that can be extrapolated from those tables. I mean, anyone who watches my channel knows that the thing I love the most about any game is its random tables, because it really releases my imagination to be able to create, not just in a vacuum, but within a nice set of constraints that are generated by these tables that provide a nice structure that make things feel like they make sense. The verisimilitude, it provides the verisimilitude of the setting. The other great thing about Mongoose Traveler is that they produced so many supplemental books. I mean, I have a whole bunch of them, maybe even all of them from the first edition. And with these books, you can just create any kind of sci-fi adventure you can imagine. You know, if you want to have a bunch of characters that are essentially futuristic rock stars going around the big cities of the world getting into trouble, you can do that. If you want to have, the old AI android rebellion happen thing, you can do that. If you want to have characters who play robots or androids, you can do that. If you essentially want to have a Star Wars kind of game, you can do that. There is rules for all of these things with very little adaptation required. So it's an extremely robust game in terms of the opportunities you can afford your players with it. Now, there was a second edition. That's the current edition, as far as I know, that was released. I do own it, but I've never played it. I've briefly skimmed through the rules, so I can't really talk too much about the rules of the second edition. I know that there were a few changes that they made, which I don't really know were necessary, but then again, I haven't played it, so who am I to comment? But I know that in the second edition they added the concept of advantage from D&D 5e, which, everybody's adding advantage because, D&D 5e is such a great game. Whatever. But the thing is, they added advantage, but they also still have modifiers. So from what I understand in 5e, the idea of advantage was that you didn't have to worry about a bunch of different modifiers, whereas the second edition of Traveler kind of does both. So I'm not really sure how that works. But as I said, I haven't played it, so I'm no expert on that. I'm far more familiar with the first edition's rules. Also, Mongoose has reprinted for the second edition a bunch of the gold classic adventures like Pirates of Dranex, which is one of the great sandboxes of all time. It's essentially, a giant space piracy game where you are privateers engaged to go into the subsector and wreak havoc with this particular lord's enemies. Traveler continues to be a great game where your players can participate in some of the most classic sci-fi tropes that are out there. The system is simple enough to play, but complex enough to provide interesting choices, which for me is always a very important thing to have my players have access to. I heartily recommend it, and that is why Traveler will always have an honored place here on the shelves of the Sage's Library. Thanks so much for joining me here today, and if you do want to help support the channel, you can like and subscribe, or if you want to join us over on Patreon, or become a member of the YouTube channel, or go to our website, memyselfanddie.com, and buy some handmade merch. All of the links for that stuff is in the description below. Thank you so much, and we will see you next time on the next Sage's Library.